Disclaimer. The following video contains detailed descriptions of abuse, kidnapping, and psychological manipulation. Some viewers may find the content distressing or disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back, guys, to my channel. Today we're going to be doing another deep dive into a very disturbing case. So I know I've already warned you guys, but once again, this is very disturbing and it's really sad. Now, hitchhiking across the United States during the 1970s was pretty common. So a cheap way to travel, and for 20-year-old Colleen Stan, it seemed like an ordinary day. Now, it's important to note that despite hitchhiking still being relatively a commonplace during the 1970s, there was a growing fear towards hitchhiking by this point, thanks to some major cases happening around this time. Little did she know, this decision would lead to a 7-year nightmare. Colleen's story is one of survival, unimaginable cruelty, and psychological control. Welcome to the story of Colleen Stan, the girl in the box. It was May 19, 1977. Colleen Stan, at just 20 years old, was on her way to visit a friend in Northern California. She had hitchhiked many times and felt pretty confident in her ability to judge safe rides from unsafe ones. After turning down 2 previous rides that just felt off, Colleen accepted a lift from a young couple, Cameron and Janice Hooker, who had a baby in the backseat. They seemed friendly, normal, safe, but this decision would change her life forever. Now, Colleen, she had hitched rides before. She was very aware of the risks, but the presence of a woman and a baby gave her a false sense of security. Cameron and Janice Hooker appeared to be a wholesome family, making them the perfect cover for their darker intentions. Now, it's important to know a little bit more information on who this Cameron and Janice Hooker were. Cameron Hooker was 23 years old, and he was with his wife, 19-year-old Janice Hooker. And turns out, they had been actively looking to kidnap somebody. Cameron was a lumber mill worker and had intense bondage fantasies. And leading up to this kidnapping, he had basically released his fantasies on his wife. Now, Cameron would drive Colleen around for some time, making casual conversations to disarm her before driving into a remote area. As the car drove deeper into rural California, Colleen's sense of safety began to wane. That's when Cameron suddenly veered off the road into a secluded area. Now, without warning, he pulled out a knife and held it to her throat, threatening her life. In an instant, Colleen's world would turn upside down. Now, shortly after Colleen entered the van, Cameron forced her into a head box. A wooden structure weighing about 20 pounds confined her head, blocked out all light, sound, and airflow. This terrifying contraption was designed to disorient her and strip away her senses, enhancing her fear. Now, this isn't the box in question, so this is just another sadistic box that Cameron must have just had. Cameron Hooker had planned this moment for months, if not possibly years. It wasn't a spontaneous kidnapping. He was a sadist who had long fantasized about abandoning a woman to serve as his personal slave. Now, after bringing back Colleen to his home in Red Bluff, California, he immediately began his reign of terror. Cameron Hooker was a disturbed individual. He sought absolute control over his victims and used a mixture of physical and psychological abuse to maintain his dominance. His wife, Janice, wasn't just a passive observer. Though also a victim of the abuse, she had made a deal with Cameron that he could abduct the woman as long as he stopped essaying her. Now, the box will be coming up soon, but for the first several months, Cameron confined Colleen to a rack where she would be beaten and tortured. Now, after a few months, Cameron would construct a coffin-sized wooden box where she would be locked up for up to 23 hours a day. Now, she spent years in isolation, and the craziest part of this is they would keep this coffin-like box underneath their bed where they would sleep on. So Colleen would spend most of her time underneath their bed in this box. Now, what's going to be crazy to point out would be that Cameron and Janice had 2 daughters in the house and were ultimately unaware of Colleen's presence. Colleen would be let out to clean or take care of the children. She would even be introduced as an in-home nanny to some of the neighbors. Now, the torture she would endure is quite honestly very disturbing. See, initially, Cameron and Janice had an agreement that Cameron would not engage in SA with Colleen. However, she would be forced to watch as they engaged in sex after Cameron tortured her. Eventually though, as Cameron would break down and Cameron would SA Colleen as part of her torture. Now, Cameron would do a lot more than physically abuse her. He would also play psychological games with her. Cameron made her wear a leather collar and leash for a long period, emphasizing his desire for control over every aspect of her life. He also referred to her as K, dehumanizing her even further. He wanted complete control. To do this, he created a fictitious group called the Company. Now, the Company, Cameron claimed, was a shadowy, omnipresent organization that watched everything Colleen did. If she ever tried to escape or told anyone about her situation, the Company would find her and kill her family. This elaborate lie kept Colleen under his control for years. On top of this, just to add on more to the psychological games he was playing, Cameron also forced Colleen to sign a slave contract, convincing her that she legally belonged to him. He told her there was no way out, no possibility of freedom. These acts and these psychological devices would later on be a huge key reason why, despite her having the opportunity to escape later on, she never did. Now, Colleen was trapped, not just physically, but mentally. Now, there was a person who, from the very beginning, played a huge role in just everything. Janice, his wife. Now, she played a central role in Colleen's captivity, but Janice's situation was complex. She had been a victim of Cameron's abuse long before Colleen entered. The age of 16, she was manipulated into becoming Cameron's wife, enduring years of torture herself. Now, it's important to note that by the time Colleen's escape, Janice had come to view her as a victim of Cameron, just like herself, which fueled her eventual decision to help Colleen leave. Now, remarkably, after several years of captivity, Cameron began to loosen his grip on Colleen. He allowed her to take small jobs outside the house and even visit her family on one occasion. But even in these moments of freedom, Colleen remained psychologically imprisoned. Now, it's important to note that when Cameron let her visit her family, he did go with her and did pose as her fiance. Colleen's family did note her unusual behavior, but they had no idea the full extent of her situation. Now, Cameron's manipulation was so effective, she never attempted to escape. She truly believed the Company would go after her and would result in the death of her family. Now, during the visit to her family, the family noticed something was off. Colleen was quieter, more reserved than usual, but they had no idea she was being held captive as an sex slave. They assumed that she was just in a bad relationship, not the prisoner of this sadistic man. When Colleen returned back to the Hooker home, it was back to the box, back to her life of unimaginable suffering. Now, Colleen's family would be heartbroken when they later learned the truth that they had been so close to saving her. Now, by 1984, the balance of control was shifting. After years of Cameron's domination, Janice could no longer ignore her guilt and fear. She began to have a change of heart, and it was Janice who would ultimately set Colleen free. However, this is the part where I have to mention that despite Janice clearly also being a victim in herself, there's another, perhaps more devious explanation as to why she might have decided to let Colleen go. Now, per Janice's confession, leading up to the escape, Cameron grew the desire to make Colleen a second wife. Janice could no longer handle that situation, and she would tell Colleen the truth that there was no Company and everything he said was a lie. Now, Janice initially thought perhaps Cameron could rehabilitate it, but after realizing he couldn't, she helped Colleen escape. But it's also important to note that after her escape, Janice would beg Colleen to not turn him in to the police. Initially, after, it seemed like that was going to be the case, but After Janice confessed everything to her pastor, she would go and turn in Cameron herself. Now this is how the escape happened. She drove her to the bus station and sent her on her way. After 7 long years, Colleen was finally free. She contacted her family, who were shocked but overjoyed to learn that she was alive. Janice going and turning in Cameron did lead to her making a deal for immunity. In return, she agreed to testify against her husband in court. Now, the truth about what had happened in these 7 years was shocking. Cameron Hooker, who's a seemingly mild-mannered man, was revealed to be a monster who had subjected Colleen to years of unimaginable cruelty. Cameron Hooker was arrested in 1984, charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, SA, and false imprisonment. Janice's testimony would be instrumental in securing this conviction. She described and detailed how Cameron had orchestrated Colleen's abduction and maintained control over her through both physical and psychological torture. In 1985, Cameron Hooker was sentenced to 104 years in prison for his crimes. The judge described him as an extreme danger to society, and he was never to be released. For Colleen, the ordeal was over, but the scars would take much longer to heal. On an important note, in 2022, there were reports that Cameron Hooker was up for parole, but was denied. This case continues to be a point of concern for those advocating for the protection and survivors of extreme abuse. Now, Colleen would change her name and live privately for some time before eventually sharing her story with the public. In interviews, Colleen has spoken about the importance of hope and perseverance, even in the darkest of situations. Now, the case of Colleen Stan, the girl in the box, is one of the most disturbing and fascinating stories of survival in modern history. The chilling reminder of the power of psychological control. Also a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit.
If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse or captivity, there is help. Please contact your local authorities or an organization that provides support for victims of trauma.